Okay. Well, I'd like to welcome everybody, all of you on here live, everybody who watches this after the fact. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Megan Beats. I've been an organizer with the LaRouche movement for 18 years now, and I had the great privilege of getting to work rather closely with Mr. LaRouche for a good number of those years. So this is the first class in a 6-week series on Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries in the science of physical economy. So today is the introduction class, so I'm going to throw a lot of ideas out at you that we will explore, dig into, unravel, and hopefully come out with a better understanding of at the end of the series. What I'd like to do is start with a short clip from Mr. LaRouche himself and let him introduce our topic.
The root of an economy is man. There's no economy among animals. An economy reflects a characteristic of people, of the human individual, the difference between the individual and the beast. That is, these cognitive powers by which we discover universal physical principles, derive new technologies or apply technology based on these principles. We apply them to our problems. And therefore we find that through our efforts, our physical efforts, or the expenditure of our time, that we are able to produce more wealth than it costs to keep us in the process of production, both in terms of our labor, in terms of the cost to maintain the families in which we come, but also in the cost to society of capital expenditures on which we rely, both in private industry and by government, including large-scale infrastructure, things of that sort. We rely upon this. Our productivity depends upon it. And therefore, it is the power of man to make discoveries and to use them. Discoveries derived from discovery of universal physical principles, which increases the value of what is produced over the cost of production.
So there was a lot in there, but that is a revolutionary notion, that the root of economics is the fundamental, unique capacity of the human being to make a revolutionary discovery which gives us the power to produce more than it cost to keep us in the process of production. That's going to be a theme throughout this entire economics series. It's Mr. LaRouche's great breakthrough, and it runs contrary to the entire dominant axiomatic system that was established in science, in culture, in philosophy, in especially the Western world for most of the 20th and now early 21st centuries. So Lyndon LaRouche was one of the greatest geniuses of the 20th century and early 21st century. And I say that full well knowing who some of his contemporaries were. He was born in 1922, and he served in World War II in the Burma theater, where he witnessed the great criminal atrocities of the British Empire colonial system. And we'll come back to this a little bit later in the discussion today. When he came back to the United States, he went on to make breakthroughs in the science of physical economy and became the most successful economic forecaster of his time, at a time when all of his so-called peers were wrong. Now, I want you to pause for a second here. I want us all to pause for a second here. And I want you to think to yourself, what is economy? Just take a minute and try to formulate an idea in your mind of what is economics, what is economy. Now I'm going to read a couple of definitions that I pulled from the internet. The first is from all of our most reliable source, Wikipedia. And Wikipedia tells us that economics is the social science that studies the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Okay. Study.com, now sounds authoritative. Study.com says, in its most simple and concise definition, economics is the study of how society uses its limited resources. Investopedia, perhaps now we're at the level of experts. Investopedia says, economics is the study of how people allocate scarce resources for production, distribution, and consumption, both individually and collectively. Now stop for a second and think of what do they mean by scarce resources? Food, money, raw material resources, land, maybe ventilators. And then finally, a definition from the American Economic Association. Economics is the study of scarcity, the study of how people use resources to respond to incentives, or the study of decision-making. Now, I didn't choose to play this clip here today, but I watched a clip yesterday on the website of the American Economics Association interviewing maybe about a dozen economists, and all of them gave some variation of this definition, that economics is the study of how people make decisions, and it's the study of human behavior and the choices they make, and how the choices that people make add up to processes that we call economics. Now, where do these ideas come from? What is the root of that kind of view of an economy? Now, I want to pull up the first slide here. This is Adam Smith, who I'm sure you've all heard of, who is cited as the father of American economics, maybe other economic systems. And this is from a very famous writing called as a short name, The Wealth of Nations, which was written in 1776. Note the date. Smith says, he is the economic actor, right? He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Now ask yourself, what is Adam Smith's conception of the human being? Is it anything other than a selfish, dumb beast? Now, you may say, oh, come on. From that quote, you're going to say Smith thought that, humans were just dumb beasts. That's a little far. Consider this next quote. This is from another work called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was written in 1759. The administration of the great system of the universe, the care of universal happiness of all rational and sensible beings, is the business of God and not of man. To man is allotted a much humbler department, but one much more suitable to the weakness of his powers and the narrowness of his comprehension. The care of his own happiness, of that of his family, his friends, his country. But though we are endowed with a very strong desire of these ends, it has been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain prompt us to apply those means for their own sake, and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them. Now, Adam Smith, when he wrote that, was an employee of the British East India Company, whose tea some American patriots dumped into the Boston Harbor, and which was the private company looting enterprise of the British Empire, which enforced a colonial looting policy around the world. Despite that history, we have a motorcycle outside. Despite that history, the poor economics student learns to predict the behavior, predict the choices and the decisions that people might make based on Adam Smith's idea of the nature of man. Now, that poor student is directed to take that idea and to construct mathematical models, which might predict the trends of prices. It might predict the availability of resources. It might predict the trends in the markets. All of these models, all of them are wrong. Now you might say, wait, you're saying all economists are wrong? Most economists on the planet today are wrong. Now, their models might seem to work for a time. This happens quite often. They seem to work for a time until they don't, because the model failed to take into account or failed to incorporate into its assumptions factors in the real world. Now, we saw this very famously in 2008, 12 years ago, when the entire world system began crashing and was almost completely blew out, really did blow out, and was only saved by a bailout. And I just want to bring up a slide which demonstrates what most economists at the time said. So this says, in 2007, economists gave a 3% chance of the economy shrinking in 2008. They gave it a less than 1 in 500 likelihood of decreasing by over 2%. They were very wrong. Now, I'm not going to play it now, but at the time, in 2007, that same time, Lyndon LaRouche warned that the financial system was about to go through a completely unstoppable blowout collapse, and he was quite right. Now, for Lyndon LaRouche, economics is none of this invisible hand, crystal ball, mumbo jumbo, what the invisible hand is going to take all of our collective selfish desires and somehow guide the markets to some beneficent end. For Lyndon LaRouche, economics is a branch of physical science, much like astrophysics, biology, chemistry. Now, why? Because economics is the science of human progress. It's the science of mankind's ability to discover, master, and apply principles of the physical universe which we discover in our imaginations, and then the consequent ability through the application, through technologies, to support the population which is growing both in number and in standard of living. In a healthy system, this process leads to an increase in the capacity of the human species to make new discoveries. This leads to an acceleration in the process of growth, both of the numbers of the human population and in the quality of life. For Lyndon LaRouche, the fundamental principle of economics was manifest in the anti-entropic nature of human action. And he asked the question, what process in the physical universe, what principle does this human action represent? Now, the people who studied Adam Smith, many of them went on to become perhaps your college professor, or perhaps the professor of your college professor, which is probably worse. However, and many of them went on to serve in administrations, like Hank Paulson of the famous 2008 bailout, like Mnuchin today, like Milton Friedman. Lyndon LaRouche was attacked, was slandered, and was falsely imprisoned. But I want to come back to Lyndon LaRouche at the end of World War II. And this is important because economic science does not occur outside of universal history. Economics has a context. It's a process. Economics is human. And therefore, we must consider the trajectory of the development of the human species on planet Earth and, as we now know, at the edge of the space age, also on other planetary bodies. Now, the context for LaRouche was the post-Franklin Roosevelt, post-World War II system. As I mentioned, LaRouche witnessed while he was deployed in South Asia the absolute brutality of colonialism. If Franklin Roosevelt had lived beyond the end of the war, we could have had a chance to end that colonial system worldwide for good. Franklin Roosevelt told Winston Churchill point blank that after the war, the colonial powers would not be allowed to go back in and claim their colonies. Now, the tragedy is that Roosevelt did die, and under a very little man, Harry S. Truman, Winston Churchill and the rest of the colonial powers were allowed to reimpose their empire. Now, in 1946, Lyndon LaRouche was back in Boston. He is a New Englander. And he was given a copy, a pre-publication copy of Norbert Wiener's book, Cybernetics, which at first he said he found very interesting. But later he said this book bothered him. This book came to change the course of his life, set his life's mission. Particularly what bothered him about this book was the notion that the development of life, the development of the biosphere, and especially the transmission of ideas within human society could be represented by statistical information theory. Now, Lyndon LaRouche set out to refute this. And in the course of that refutation, he came to make the breakthroughs I've referenced over the period of 1948 to 1952 in physical economy. So I want to pull up a quote. This is from a writing from 1992, I believe, perhaps 94, I think it's 92, written by LaRouche called On LaRouche's Discovery. He says, let me get my cheat sheet. He says, "The central feature of my original contribution to the Leibniz science of physical economy is the provision of a method for addressing the causal relationship between, on the one side, individuals' contributions to axiomatically revolutionary advances in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge, and on the other side, consequent increases in the potential population density of corresponding societies." I'm going to read that one more time, actually, because it's quite dense. "The central feature of my original contribution to the Leibniz science of physical economy is the provision of a method for addressing the causal relationship between, on the one side, individuals' contributions to axiomatically revolutionary advances in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge, and on the other side, consequent increases in the potential population density of corresponding societies." So economics, according to LaRouche, is a continuous process of anti-entropic growth. But that continuous process depends on a succession of breakthrough discoveries. Now, the paradox there, which we will explore in this class series, is this seemingly paradoxical relationship between the clear existence of a continuous process of human development and the fact that it depends upon discontinuous scientific breakthroughs. Now, I want to go through just a little pedagogy here to begin to get at that idea, which also gets at the epistemological fallacy in modern economics of the idea that the economy is just the aggregate of individual choices. Now, I want you to remember back to your geometry class, and I want you to think of the definition of a point. So a point, according to Euclidean geometry, which we are all taught, a point is that which has no breadth, depth, or width. Try to imagine that. That which has no width, depth, or breadth. It's nothing. Now, Euclid says if we string together a succession of points, a succession of nothings in one direction, we have a line. That which has length, but no breadth or depth. If we now string together a succession of breadthless lines, we're left with a surface. That which has width and breadth, but no depth. Okay. Now, here, if we pull up the slide, here is a surface. I'm sure you all recognize the square. Here is another surface, a circle. Now, there is a very famous problem that was confronted by the ancient Greeks, which earned the name the squaring of the circle. And the challenge was to geometrically construct a square which had the same area as a given circle. Now, many people struggled over this for many, many centuries. One very famous solution that was offered by Nicholas of Cusa, who's the father of the Golden Renaissance in Italy, the father of the modern nation state, and much more, posed it this way. Let's pull up the slide. So here we have a square inside of a circle. Now, clearly, the area of the square is smaller than the circle. I want you to imagine what would happen if you doubled the number of sides. So imagine each of the 4 sides, right, now being split in half, and now we have an octagon. Just picture it in your mind. That's closer to the circle, isn't it? Didn't the area become bigger? Now, what if you double the number of sides again? And you get a 16-sided polygon. Well, that's closer to the circle. What if you doubled it again and again? What if you doubled it 100 times? At what point is that area close enough to measure the circle? So I want you to look at this. Now, the more we double the sides, the closer we seem to get an area to the circle. But what Cusa said is, actually, you're farther away than ever. Now, this is for 2 reasons. One, no matter how many times we double the sides, there's always a difference. And you see that pictured here between the shaded area, which is a slice of the polygon, and the curvature of the circular perimeter. You see that little sliver outside of the gray area. Now, the other and perhaps more important reason is that the circle is everywhere curved. The polygon is everywhere linear. If we made a 1,000,000-sided polygon, we would have 1,000,000 lines and 1,000,000 vertices, 1,000,000 corners. The circle has no sides and no corners. So Cusa said there is a fundamental species difference between the polygon, linear, and the circle. the curved, and the straight. This was the beginning of the idea of the transcendental. And what Cusa said is that they are different species. You will never, ever generate a circle from a line. Now, to bring this back to economics, the circle is not just a geometric shape. The circle has a certain importance in physics and physical reality. It's a principle, it represents a principle of construction, a principle of efficient action. For example, the circle is the shape which encompasses the greatest area with the least perimeter. This came to be known as the isoperimetric theorem. Now, I want to show you something. This is a circle. I've already said that you cannot generate this shape from anything straight, from a line and from a point. But the question is, can we generate a line and a point from a circle? Well, what did I just do? So we have a circle. When we perform circular action on that circle by folding, we get a line. If I perform circular action again on that circle, we get a point. And so it seems that the circle is actually elementary, not the parts. The whole is first. The parts are consequent. Now think about that with economics. Now back to the economic paradox which confronted Lyndon LaRouche, that each revolutionary discovery completely redefined our axioms, our beliefs about the way we thought the physical universe worked, about what we thought space was made of, about what we thought matter was made of and how it worked. And there was no way to logically go from the prior system of beliefs to the new system of beliefs. For example, the discovery of the nucleus of the atom, of atomic physics, did not come from a logical elaboration of the principles of chemistry. It was a completely new kind of idea, which was not suggested, was not to be found anywhere within the axioms and beliefs of a chemical world. Now, similarly, chemistry did not come logically as a consequence of prior ideas of alchemy. It was a completely new insight into the nature of matter. Now, the paradox is that each of these stages in succession represents a break from the previous stage. And yet, this ordered succession is what we call human progress. There is a continuous subsuming function. Now, LaRouche's question is, what is that? What is that whole which generates each of the parts? And how can we measure it as a driver in the economic process? Now, LaRouche's solution to that, which we'll dig into, led to new and scientifically truthful ideas to lay at the basis of policymaking for economics. Now, in the late 1960s, Lyndon LaRouche was living in Manhattan, and he was, I'm forgetting the name of his profession now. Thank you. He was a management consultant living in New York City, but he was also teaching economics courses at some of the New York universities and college, such as Queens College and Columbia University. And in the incredible political ferment of the 1960s, LaRouche, who was on the campuses, began to recruit a youth movement. This was an incredibly tumultuous time for many reasons people may know, including the Vietnam War, but also the fact that the former colonized nations were beginning to gain their independence. And they were beginning to demand their God-given rights for development. Now, this terrified the empire more than anything else. And just to give you a sense of that, out of this came a doctrine called NSSM 200, which was penned by Henry Kissinger in the United States, that declared it a national security threat to the United States for any of these former colonial nations to develop, because they would begin to use their own resources. But the other tactic that the empire took is to impose, partly through the IMF and World Bank institutions, and partly at almost literal gunpoint, forced these nations to adopt policies of economic deregulation, opening their economies and their natural resources to private looting, and to lock them into loans that, because of the conditionalities, they would never be able to pay back. They would become debt slaves. Now, LaRouche fought these policies, and he denounced the economists who were trying to justify it. And in December of 1971, Lyndon LaRouche debated a then famous economist named Abba Lerner. Let's pull up the picture. So you see LaRouche seated on the left smoking the pipe, and you see Abba Lerner there in front of the blackboard. Abba Lerner was the darling of these neoliberal economists who LaRouche was slamming at the time. And in this debate, LaRouche got Lerner to blurt out, as a logical consequence of the argument that he was forming, that if 1920s Germany had just accepted the economic austerity policies of Hjalmar Schacht, who later went on to become the economics minister for Adolf Hitler. If Germany had just accepted Schachtian economics, then Hitler would not have been necessary. Now that filled the room with a stunned silence and completely destroyed Abba Lerner. Now it also earned Lyndon LaRouche the ire. Oh yeah, here we go. There's LaRouche there. It also earned LaRouche the complete ire of the establishment in the United States and elsewhere. Now, coming out of that, Lyndon LaRouche formed a burgeoning, growing youth movement, and in 1976 began a process of running for the presidency of the United States. He ran 8 times between 1976 and 2004, including from jail. Now, there's lots and lots to say about LaRouche's presidential campaigns, but what I want to do is I want to talk in somewhat general terms. I want to just say a few things about what Lyndon LaRouche did worldwide during the 30 years of his runs for office. So let's just pull up some of these slides. So Lyndon LaRouche authored a policy called How the International Development Bank Will Work, proposing to replace the IMF World Bank systems, which had been hijacked by the empire, with an international financial institution which could give credit to large-scale development projects to any nation at low interest. Here you see LaRouche in the 1980s speaking on the large-scale infrastructure development projects proposed in Thailand and his program to develop the Pacific and Indian Ocean basins. Here's a copy of that program. Here you see LaRouche in 1983 at a New Hampshire presidential debate with Ronald Reagan, where LaRouche struck up a certain relationship with Reagan and was later brought in to the Reagan administration as a back-channel negotiator to the Soviet Union in an attempt to end the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation, mutually assured destruction, through LaRouche's proposal of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Right here you see this pamphlet we got out. The LaRouche organization disseminated this pamphlet everywhere. Here you see LaRouche in Russia. I think this was shortly after he was released from prison. But here you see LaRouche in Russia. This was a trip where he was invited to make a speech to the Russian Academy of Sciences. Here you see LaRouche in India, and his program for the industrialization of India. Now, there are no pictures of it, but LaRouche and Mrs. LaRouche met several times with the President of India, the Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, and met with her exactly about the idea of bringing India fully out of the thumb of this colonial British policy through a full program for industrialization. Here you see the cover of our program for the industrialization of Africa. Here you see LaRouche in Mexico, right? This is Mexico? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Here you see LaRouche in Mexico, and then next to him, Dennis Small, who some of you heard translating on the discussion with Helga LaRouche the other day. And here you see LaRouche's program that he developed after meeting with the president of Mexico, José López Portillo, in the 1980s for a full program of the development of Mexico called Operation Juarez. So, that's just a sampling. If Lyndon LaRouche's proposals had been implemented, had been allowed to be implemented, and let me mention that many of these leaders, either that worked directly with LaRouche or worked with some of those people, many of those people were assassinated, as Indira Gandhi was, run out of office, as López Portillo was. But if Lyndon LaRouche's policies had been allowed to be implemented, we would have ended poverty as a phenomenon among human society today. This would already be part of our past. We would not be dealing with a global pandemic right now. So what I want to put on the table with this class series, the real issue for all of us is to respond to truthfulness with LaRouche's ideas, with a deep understanding of what he discovered, and then our taking up the responsibility for a further advancement of those ideas. We have the potential to have the greatest renaissance and rate of progress for humankind ever before. So the challenge is, because human beings evolve willfully, because the only way we really progress as a species is in overturning previous bad ideas or imperfect ideas and replacing them with more truthful ones. The challenge for all of us is to take up this study and to educate others, and to do it very quickly because we have a global emergency. Now, the world is in the process of entering a new paradigm if we're not eliminated by the threat of war, which is very real today. But the world's entering a new paradigm. We see that with the disintegration of the power of the so-called Western, but really global financial system. And we especially see that with what's been catalyzed by the Chinese policy of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is resonant with the program of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, the World Land Bridge. But this new paradigm, I'm convinced, will not be successful ultimately unless it's guided by the scientific insights into economy of Lyndon LaRouche. So that is our challenge, and I'm extremely happy that all of you have decided to join this class series. So let me just, before we open up for discussion, let me just give a little preview of the next 5 weeks. So today was obviously an introductory discussion. You got a chance to meet Lyndon LaRouche a little bit and get a sense of the kinds of concepts that we'll be tackling. In the next classes, we will look at the idea of economic value. What is a truthful idea of economic value in physical economy? We will dispense with the fraud of the idea that there are limits to growth and limits to resources, with the idea that the fundamental basis of economics is scarcity. We will look at the real economic value of culture, of classical culture, of beautiful ideas. We will look at money, and we'll come up with a more truthful notion of money and the role of money in an economy. And then finally, we will end with a class, kind of a programmatic class, looking at the LaRouche plan to reopen the economy for 1.5 billion productive jobs, the World Land Bridge policy, and what we all have to do coming out of this.